Thanks, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I teach, I'm loud, so hopefully. First, I just want to thank the BDBI, there we go, and TAG for the invitation to participate and help moderate this, especially Tomas, Lou, Alich, and all the people behind the scenes who worked to put this together. It's an honor to be here, and it's exciting because we get to bring together all of these folks from the Latino community. And a little bit about me. So I'm a historian, that's my training. And when I decided I wanted to become a historian, I knew I wanted to study the history of protest and race, and that I was passionate about African American Latino history, but I had no idea going into grad school that I was going to end up focusing on Boston, which is my hometown. And the project really came to develop because I did a lot of research on the civil rights movement, and I realized what a gaping hole there was in the scholarship. There's very little written about Boston civil rights movement. It's not really seen as a site that's of importance, right? Because we heavily emphasize the South. But in the few works written on the city, the Latino community was totally invisible, right? Very black and white. And my parents migrated, since we're all doing personal histories here, my parents migrated in 1971 to Boston from Costa Rica. And having grown up in here, I also felt invisible, right? And so I came to this work interested in what is the relationship between African Americans and Latinos in the city, and where do they overlap in the neighborhoods? How do they build communities and institutions? And how do they build movements? So just to frame the conversation, as many people know, this history of school desegregation or busing, I don't use busing often, but we can talk about that, is told through a very black-white lens. And our goal here is to really disrupt it, which is where the title came from, Disrupting the Narrative. We want to look at all, not just kind of busing in this singular way that, it's just something that came out the blue, but really what is the longer history of Latinos organizing in the schools before, leading up to, through the desegregation era, and since then. So we're gonna pretty much get started. I will say just a couple things briefly. I'm really committed to public history. I think this is really exciting to be able to do stuff as academics. And Dr. Rivera can chime in here too. Sometimes it feels like we're just writing to 5 people. And it's just a very ivory tower, and you're just having conversations with the same 5 people. But being able to know that, I was invited because my work had extended into the community is really exciting, and what I had truly hoped for. My work wouldn't be possible without folks who are willing to share their stories. And so being able to, facilitate these dialogues is really important. So we curated a little history here on your program. It's short because we were trying to make it very legible. I'm just gonna highlight like a couple quick things to frame the conversation. So if you're less familiar with Boston's history, the Latino community really grew post-war, especially in the 1960s and 1970s. Boston didn't know what to do with Latino children as far as where do they fit into the narrative. They were kind of a problem, right? They were kind of a problem. And even though the state and the city had established, migrant and ESL programs, those were really not meeting the needs of Latino children. There were way too many Latino children who could be part of it. And they had this kind of unique issue of linguistic need, meaning that many of them had to, figure out how to speak English and navigate the schools. So in terms of the long history, which is what we're hoping to get to, Latino people in Boston have historically taken community control over their organizations. They established their own programs, they fought to establish bilingual education, and then they fought to maintain it. When the Garrity decision came in 1974, very few people had considered, how do Latino people fit into this? Or Asian folks or other folks, right? In fact, Garrity's decision included a footnote that said, we know this is going to impact other people, but we actually don't know how, so we can't deal with that. And that's the extent to which Latino people are mentioned in the Garrity decision, original decision. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about today is how the Latino community rallied during desegregation to intervene in the case, how they were impacted by desegregation, and then how the fight for bilingual education and kind of quality education for Latinos continued beyond that kind of singular moment in the mid-70s. Also want to tell you that we curated a bunch of resources in an effort to, again, make things available to the public, which I know not everyone spends their time reading archival sources. But if you're interested, we curated a ton of sources, articles, books, documentaries, but also a bunch of newspaper articles specifically about Latinos in education from the Globe, from the Bay State Banner and such. So if you're interested, please check out the QR code if you want to learn more. Okay, last introductory piece is kind of like, what does a historian do? I tell my students, a lot of them come in and say, like, what really happened? They come in and they really want to know, like, what's the truth? And we always say historians are not truth tellers. In fact, there's no quest for an essential truth. What we do is we really focus on documenting news stories, placing them in dialogue, and then analyzing, interpreting the past. So we do meticulous research, we put sources together, and then we try and make sense of that. So while I'm a true nerd and I could live in the archives, in reality, the archives are not for us. They've never been for us. Many marginalized peoples, Latinos, but also African Americans and indigenous peoples, we don't leave the same written record. We don't have the luxury to be sitting down writing all of our stories, and so the archives don't reflect our histories. So for me, that drew me to become like an oral historian, and that is largely so that I can ask my elders what their experiences were. And I'm grateful to study such a recent period where our elders are still reading. I'm so sorry, you're like, who's an elder? Who's an elder? Listen, okay, it's all love. So anyways, all this to say, the goal here is to really have a range of perspectives. The Latino community is not a monolith. We don't all agree. We will hear about that. We don't all agree on what happened. We don't agree with each other. We don't all get along. Right? Everybody knows. But the idea here is to kind of have like a diverse range of perspectives to really document Boston's kind of rich history of race and community building and activism. So with that, I'm going to stop talking because the goal here is to lift the voices up of Boston's Latino residents and leaders so that they can tell their own stories. So I'm just going to do a brief introduction. First, I'd like to introduce my co-moderator, Taina Gonzalez. Taina is a BPS and TAG graduate and works in the field of health equity, especially for Latino communities. And we're going to kind of do this. I'll do the first half of the panel, and then she'll facilitate the second part. So I'll turn it to her when the time comes. And then as far as our panelists, unfortunately, one of our panelists, Betty, is not able to be here today. So that's very sad. But hopefully her other half can also speak to her experiences and their experiences together. So I'll start with David Cortiella, who just gave a little wave in the middle here. He's from Puerto Rico and also was a member of El Comité de Padres, which advocated for bilingual ed during the Garrity case and afterwards. Heavily involved in the movement. He was attorney for the Massachusetts Security Commission and held executive roles in Boston, including Director of Affirmative Action and Boston Housing Authority. Welcome, David. Yes. Next, I'll move on to introduce Mercedes Gonzalez, little wave. Also Puerto Rican, was a student and teenage mother during the busing era. She's also the proud mother of 4 Boston Exam School and TAG graduates, including Tomas, who I don't know where he went, including Tomas, and a devoted grandmother to many, including Taina. Okay, welcome, Mercedes. And I'll introduce Eldin Villafañe, is that right? Villafañe. Born and raised in Villa Victoria in the South End, attended Boston schools during the city's desegregation efforts. He's also an experienced communication strategist, worked on political campaigns, and is an accomplished writer, having written about his experiences growing up in Boston. So welcome, Eldin. And then for the second part of the panel, we'll transition from kind of the historical experiences to the more contemporary. And we're going to have some folks who can speak to that. We didn't have enough room, so we're going to have you wave from here. So first, I'll introduce Dr. Lorna Rivera. Give a little wave. Dr. Rivera is a professor of leadership in education and director of the Mauricio Gaston Institute for Latino Community Development and Public Policy at UMass Boston. She's a renowned scholar specializing in Latinx education, among many other things, published widely, leads federally funded research on issues related to Latinx communities. She also oversees the TAG and Alerta Latino programs and is a wonderful mentor and colleague. So welcome to Dr. Rivera. And last but not least, I'll introduce Simel Rodriguez. Give us a little wait. Simel is from the Dominican Republic and moved to Boston in 2011. She is the mother of 3 BPS students and an advocate for Boston families since joining the St. Stephen's Youth Program, and she currently serves there as the Parent Mentor Coordinator. Welcome, Simel. All right, let's get this party started. So I'm a historian, so I like to go chronologically through things. So we're gonna start early on. So you have to remember to pass the microphone, both of you on each side. Just, microphone's not for in the room, so it's weird. But all right, so I'm gonna actually begin by exploring what Boston schools look like in the 60s and 70s. So before we get to organizing, I think it's kind of important to just frame what Boston schools look like, particularly how Latino migrants fit into that. So I'd like to start with you, Mercedes. Can you talk a little bit about what your experience was like when you arrived to Boston, being a Puerto Rican migrant, but particularly like what were your first impressions of Boston public schools? Yeah.
Didn't like them.
Didn't like them.
Didn't speak English, so it was hard for me to, just speak Spanish, and nobody else speaks English. I mean, nobody else spoke Spanish, so I was the only one. Me and my sister went to school together, and we didn't get treated very well because we were 2 Hispanic girls in the 6th grade, and we were in South Boston. And yeah, I wasn't happy, but the school was, teachers were fine. It's more the students that were a little rough with us.
Were most of the students white?
Oh, everybody else was
Everyone
white.
was white. Okay.
Yes.
One of the things that's interesting is we were talking about what her experience might be like growing up in Southie, because many of us didn't go to Southie for a lot of reasons. Southie had a reputation to not go to Southie. So can you talk, like, were most of your teachers white? Can you talk a little bit about what your school looked like, or?
It was, they call it the portable, so it was like a little trailer schools. And this was in South Boston. And for all the girls, the boy went to another school, which I don't remember the name right now.
Okay.
But it was in South Boston. My brothers went there. The girls went to that little portable school. And they didn't teach us anything because we didn't speak the language. So good thing we knew a little bit about math and English a little bit from Puerto Rico. And we were able to get good grades because otherwise they would,
So there were no services for you in terms of language or support? Nothing.
No.
Okay. And what about, so one of the things we know is that you became a mother very young.
Very young.
What was your experience like? So how old were you? What was your experience like in the schools when you became pregnant and had your first child?
Well, I had to drop out of school because there was no way they would accept a pregnant girl in school at the time. And what was the question?
And just what happened after that?
Well, nobody went looking for me, so they never asked my parents, okay, why is she not in school? They was like...
So you just left the school?
I left the school and nobody...
And nobody came?
Nobody came, nobody cared, and just stay home and raise my, have my kids and raise them without nobody coming by and say, why she drop out of school? Which I thought it was very weird. More weird when I had my kids, because if they were out one day, I would get a call from the teacher saying why they're not here. And at that time, nobody cared.
Yeah. Wow. One of the things we were talking about was how the Task Force on Children Out of School, a very important task force, published, this amazing report that documented that over 50% of Latino children were excluded from Boston public schools at the time in the late 60s and early 70s. And we were saying Mercedes was one of those people who was out of school, that there were just lots and lots of Latino children just not in school. No one came looking for you. And then you never went back, right?
No, never went back.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, thank you. Eldin, can you jump in here too? So you're a little bit younger, you're a different generation.
Yes, very young.
Very, very young. so young. You're not my elder, don't worry,
young.
not my elder. But you grew up in the 70s, And what were your kind of earliest memories of Boston schools just more generally? Like, what was your experience like being a Latino child? What do you remember? Like, were the schools any good?
No, I remember. Look, I remember when I went to the William Monroe Charter School, Phyllis Wheatley Middle School, and then Copley Square, which is now Snowden High School. And so what I remember is just like everybody it was packed, like herding cattle from one classroom to the other. And it was pretty mixed. It was a predominantly black student populations, some Latinos and some white. And I just remember us racing to get tater tots. I just remember lunch hour a lot on how we would like wager and trade the chocolate milk with the tater tots. And if we got a chance to go outside to get honey buns, because that was like the big thing then, those honey buns. But so we made our connections to whether it's black or Latinos to our common situation, and a lot of that was to our I was probably better off than most because my parents were educators and I was middle, but everybody had this connection of like trying to make ends meet, parents trying to make ends meet, poverty and being poor, or so we had some kind of common connection. But what I can remember is that just lots of us moving from one classroom to the other, and doing things like that, wagering, working, doing the tater tot thing, and just finding common ground in on these type of ways of interacting. So yeah.
Do you remember, like, and you spoke English growing up, but
Yeah,
did you remember the experience, like, having immigrants in your classes at all?
No, I don't. It was a good population of the Latinos. They were Puerto Rican, and we spoke Spanglish. I know I was more dominant in English, so we spoke. That was good for me. I mean, we spoke Spanglish, but so I didn't experience that, and I don't.
There was
recall,
no, okay,
I
yeah.
don't recall. No, I don't. I'm trying to think back when. I mean, very different from today. So when my kids, and they've enjoyed the Brookline schools system, and it's so diverse, and they're learning languages. And I remembering it's just bilingual. They either know Spanish or English, and I just tend to veer toward the English. So yeah, I don't remember myself.
Did you either of you? Did your parents think the schools were good?
My parents didn't. They were not very educated.
They were not very educated. So what was their relationship with the schools?
None.
None. Okay.
We had a nun, and there was two nuns that came to the house, and if anything went wrong in the school, they would contact them, and they would come over and talk to my parents about, if the child did good in school or bad,
Okay.
but not them, because they wouldn't speak English. So
Okay.
there was two nuns, and it was, remember Miss Dunn, Miss Virginia Dunn? You remember? Yeah, and the other nun was called Francisca Georgia.
Yeah, and they were both named and hugely part of the task force. They were part of the task force. They went door to door knocking to document all the people out of school.
Out of school, yes.
Wow. See, you do remember. You were worried about names and things. You do remember a lot. And what about you? Were your parents?
Yeah, my parents. My mother was a Boston public school teacher.
What was her experience like?
She was bilingual ed. At the Agassiz, and then before that, what's the school in Villa Victoria that was
Like near the Blackstone?
the Blackstone? Actually, yeah, Blackstone. And so she was tough. She's strong. My mother is retired now. She's alive, but she was tough. She would give us the stories how she was just exhausted, having to deal with the bureaucracy and having to push this idea that, listen, kids understand they're smarter than you think, and we can't coddle them in certain ways. And I had the opportunity to see some of those classes and just sit in those classes and just see the way she managed these kids. I don't know how many. They looked like 50 kids in the classroom, but she was able to. That's
Probably right. Yeah.
Right, but she was able to manage them, and she was just. I just remember her being exhausted. Maybe that's why I didn't get enough spanks or something like that. It was my issue. She was just too tired. And then, but I think because of that, they became good advocates like this on my behalf. And there were situations where, for me, very quick story, in English high school, for my English paper at Copley Square High School, you have to write an English paper, and I was doing all the research. I have all the paperwork to show at the Copley library, the main library, across the street. And I did all my work, I submitted it, the teacher gave me an A with an asterisk and said, see me at the office. And she said, there's no way you wrote this. And I remember from there on, just the questioning that I could ever have written this. My father was irate, and my mother was like, don't get involved. Maybe, I'm a Boston public school teacher. I don't So, but he went there with me, and I remember them saying, well, did you write this? Because you're the professor. You have a doctorate, and you got so you must have written it for your son on these accusations. And I just remember that from there on. I just remember that. And maybe that's, and I showed and proved the written paperwork of all the studies, and it just they kept quiet. At that point, they couldn't debate it because I had evidence to show that I actually wrote this English paper. But from there on, I knew that I had to really work on proving myself and my writing, and now I'm in a profession that writes, and I write and I'm published. But I'm not. Those are not the only stories that I know. I've had my other friends and peers who've had that same, as a Latino especially, with the language. Because for the longest time when I was in school, they would say I had writing comprehension issues. And it was not that, it was just the way I took information. That's and I was an exploratory learner, I guess, is what I was told. But I had stories. I was full of stories and expressed myself. I just had to have time, and I did it a little slower than everybody. So anyway, that was my experience.
No, thank you. It's funny that anyone would think that your professor parent would write for you, because as a professor, we're probably like the last ones who would write for our kids. But I appreciate that perspective. I think you speak a lot about just kind of how BPS schools thought Black and brown children were dumb, right? And that, right, we have that notorious, there are no inferior schools, only inferior students, as said by the Boston School Committee member. And so that, it speaks to that how much that lingered. David, I'd like to get you into the conversation. So you came to Boston a little older. You didn't grow up here, grew up in New York. We still like you though, right?
I'm a Bostonian.
Yeah, I've been here long enough, right? So can you talk a little bit about like what your initial thoughts were about the Latino community when you arrived to Boston, and like what your first impressions of the schools were?
Good evening. I arrived in Boston in September '73 to come to college. I've been organizing in New York City. I grew up went from Manatí, Puerto Rico to Brooklyn, and was influenced by Young Lords, the Black Panthers, and other organizing that was going on. So my first experience here in Boston, and it was ironic, was that our mentor, my wife's mentor, Betty, and my mentor, I didn't know her in '73, was Rodolfo Rodriguez. And he was organizing residents at Mission Hill. And if you remember, this is 1973. It wasn't until 1978 that the Mission Hill was put into receivership. Doris Buntes and others who put the Housing Authority in receivership for the poor conditions. And Rodolfo invited me there to essentially take over the property management office, chain ourselves to the door, and highlight the conditions that squatters were being evicted from the public housing community without due process. And also the living conditions, highlight the living conditions. So imagine, you got this Blanquito coming over and we're talking about living conditions in there. Yeah, I came from Cambridge to come over, but it was Caribe and it was Mora and it was other organizers who were there at the time who were raising conditions in our communities. That was my introduction to Boston. And it was always around housing issues. After that, getting to know Lucy Cuadrado, who had organized Inquilino Boricua en Acción and founded Via Victoria. So The education system, look, I mean, just like Eldin, right? So I didn't know English when I came to the United States. And in my first grade, PS 77 in Brooklyn, New York, since I knew math, for some reason, I knew how to do math, and I smiled all day long in class. At the end of the first grade, they told my mom to put me to school for the retarded. Now, later on, when I doing research on migration of Puerto Ricans to New York and the creation of community, I found that it was a study in 1957 that was done by Cardoza, who showed that a lot of Puerto Rican kids were being sent to, because we didn't have special needs schools at the time, right? They was being sent to school for mentally disabled, the school for the retarded. So it wasn't on, like, right? So we were, and just like what you were saying is, we only knew each other. So I had 3 older brothers, I mean, a sister and an older brother, and we spoke Spanish in the schoolyard, and olvídate, that was just a reason for being punished. And I bet you that the kids in schools here in Boston were going through the same exact thing. I mean, it doesn't make a difference where you are, you're being treated the same exact way.
Thank you. And this is for anyone in the panel. Can you talk a little bit about like that period in the late 60s, early 70s, what you remember about the relationship between the Latino community and the African American community? This was a time of a lot of protests and a lot going on. David, you said you got involved immediately in housing things. How did you see the communities interacting, or, you know, as the Garrity decision is coming in 74?
Yeah, so what were we fighting about? We were fighting about quality housing, jobs, and better education, right? And in the jobs area, Madison Park was being constructed. This is before the construction of Villa Victoria. And Chuck Turner organized the Third World Jobs Clearinghouse. I mean, and I named names that I could remember because these were struggles about building community. So we were in the white community, primarily Italians, controlled the unions and prevented us from being involved in the union, so therefore prevented us from having jobs that required prevailing wage. So the Third World Jobs Clearinghouse, with protesting, I think it was Gilbane that built this, were the ones who stopped construction, who opened up the unions to us to make sure that we were part of the unions. The daycare movement, I mean, in Escuelita, even before Escuela Guaybanabela, before that, we had a Escuelita. It was the St. Stephen's Church, and also there was another church where we had daycare centers, and trying to get us into the Head Start programs was a struggle. So we had to create our own daycare centers, and trying to get them to be funded became a community effort. We were doing things. Organizing at that time, right, was organizing. We didn't have Univision, we didn't have social media. So you had to find a way of getting people into community basements, the convent over here at Magazine Street. The St. Stephen's Church was a center for everything and everybody. You had organizations, progressive organizations like the Pillsbury. It was George Pillsbury. It was the foundation in Central Square that was the Haymarket People's Foundation. Haymarket People Foundation that rented to you a projector for $5 and rented you movies for $1 so we could show movies in Spanish as a way of organizing people to come. And then we would have the discussions about either housing or education. Y el Comité de Padres, and you guys put on the organizers unknowingly put on the leaflet one of the founders of El Comité de Padres. She was a teacher. Her partner, Nati, this is Daisy Diaz, her partner, Nati, Rodolfo Rodriguez, and Betty Rivera were the organizers. And they were coming out of daycare movements and housing. Daisy and Nati were teachers in the schools and organizers. So these are folks whose name doesn't appear anywhere. where these were coalitions with the Black community in Boston were essential. And then as we started to organize for Latinos, working closely with the Asian community, Cape Verdean community, Italians, because we had something in common, and it was language access. So
Thank you.
it was hard. It wasn't easy stuff.
Mercedes or Eldin, do you want to comment on kind of, you came of age in different times, but also in different neighborhoods. We know Boston's a city of neighborhoods. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on kind of what was your relationship between the Latino community and the African-American community, either in South Boston or in the South End.
We didn't have much of Black community. We didn't have much. It was just mainly white people or Spanish. But we did have a friend. She was Black. She very nice. We got along fine.
Just that one friend. Okay.
Yeah. That's all it was, one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
At that time. Yeah.
And so you, in terms of like where you grew up in Southie, there wasn't, it was very segregated white, right?
Yes.
How did the white students and people treat you as one of the very few kind of Puerto Rican families?
I didn't have no problems with any of them, but my brothers had a lot of problems. They got beat up a lot. Yeah. They were not able to walk around the beach side because they would get beat up. They would come home beat up. In Casa Island, yes, around that area. Or Carson Beach or whatever they call it.
Yeah, there's very famous battles on Carson Beach,
Yes,
right?
yes, my brothers got beat up a lot. We came here, 9 children at the same time with my mother. My father was already living here with 2 of my older brothers. So for us, it was like really, we came in the summertime, so we didn't start school until September. And when we came, they put my sister and I in school. And the girls would always say something wrong to my sister. My sister was a fighter. She liked to fight. So we got beat up a lot, but only because of my sister.
No. I love that. She's not here to defend herself.
No,
Yeah.
and I did tell her that I would mention that.
Well, what about you, Eldin? What was your thought? Because you said your schools, first of all, you went to schools named for Black people throughout history. Love that. So what was your experience like? Because they're predominantly Black spaces.
Well, you mentioned neighborhood too, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up
neighborhood and schools. Yeah,
so I
go
grew
ahead.
up in Villa Victoria, right? And so during that time was good number of Puerto Rican, and then not too far was Cathedral, right? And then not too far from that was this South Boston, right? Then not too far from that was Charlestown. And so in September, I tried to, and I knew it was the anniversary of the busing, and I think I tried to capture that story in the Globe. In September, I wrote this piece because I was trying to figure out how do I express. I know others were writing about it and giving their point of view. And so I decided, you know what, I want to just share about my experience just playing with others during this desegregation, and while the elected officials were fighting it out and arguing about the desegregation, and while that was going on, there was this common ground that we had of us kids just playing pickup games like football, baseball, basketball, and we'd take our bikes and go to South Boston. And I remember then it's nothing like the seaport. You know, it was just all very fish industries and yard. But we'd venture there, right, and play a game or get some friends, and they'd follow us, and we'd go to like the Peters Park, right, and pick up like a football game. And the kids from Cathedral, so it was like Black, some Italian, Puerto Rican playing together. And, you know, we didn't pick Puerto Rican versus white. We just picked who was probably better than the other, or who can be a better. And, you know, we were just picking our teams like that. And so our experience was just through this experience of playing together and at that time we were like 12, probably 10, 12 years old average. And we just found some common experiences through that, while our older siblings or our parents were having issues and struggling with the busing. We found some common connection and a shared experience. So as I say in this article, I say our sanctuaries were these playgrounds, and we would travel to each other's homes. And so I learned how to eat cabbage in someone's house. That was the first time I tasted cabbage. I asked anybody, do you have picante or something for this cabbage? I need some flavor for this cabbage. So I learned about smells and odors and foods from just going post-game. We would just head out to people's house. And I had friends that would just follow me because they knew my mother was cooking. My mother, she was cooking arroz con gandules or something. And they would just love to eat. And it could be some kid from East End. My mother said, ¿Qué esto niño aquí? Who's in my he's with me. He's okay, he must be hungry. So we'll feed him. And so that was like my experience of that. Not to take away from everything else that was going on, but that was memories for me.
I love that. I think it's really good because sometimes there is an overemphasis on the trauma, and also this idea that Black and Latino and white kids were not living together, right? There's this idea that, yes, segregation was real, but I think your story is very South End, right? The South End was a lot more of an interracial space than other neighborhoods historically, right? Being a port for immigrants and such. And then that changed with gentrification and, urban renewal and such. But I'd love to hear from you two. So what was your reaction? You were either adults or sort of adults, but parents, when desegregation started happening. What was your both reactions to the case and Garrity's decision?
Well, my kids were not old enough to go to school yet. I live with my sister lived with me. She used to go to South Sea High, and she said we moved to Jamaica Plain right after the segregation, but she didn't get to do the busing or anything like that.
Why did she move because of that, or?
No, I think I was mentioning to my son that in South Boston, when we first came here, that they said the gringos, that's what we used to call them, they went and bombed our houses.
Okay.
So we all had to move, and we had to move to Watertown.
Okay. Can you explain a little? You can't throw that in here. So can you explain a little bit more? What year? What happened?
Well,
what bombed?
My sister knows the days. That's what I said. She remembers more than me. I was more busy having my kids. It was in 1973, March of 1973, because she remembers that her birthday was in March, and she was at that. It was like a convent. They took us from South Boston, and they moved every Spanish person. And that's when they came looking for the Latinos, why they were not attending school, because they were all at that convent in Waltham. That's what it was, Waltham.
And can you explain a little bit more about like how that happened? Like why were people bombing your house, and how did you respond to that?
My kid's father had a cousin. They own a store, and the white kids will go there and drop everything in the floor. They would just dump everything in the floor. They would break and I guess they got into a fight, and then they decided to just bomb everybody out of the houses. So my in-laws were at the time with the kids, but my brothers-in-law were like almost my age. We all had to move out of there because it was just. So you moved out just before South Boston became the kind of center point of desegregation.
Exactly. That's wild. Yeah.
Okay. It wasn't a move out. Look, let's call it what it was. St. Monica's was the first in late 60s. St. Monica's Church in the heart of South Boston was the site of the first Spanish-speaking mass in the city of Boston. There were bodegas on Broadway.
That was my kid's cousin. Yeah.
Todo el mundo lo llamaba, ¿verdad? La montaña de los chivos, el monte de los chivos, allá cerca de Castle Square.
No, this store was actually in Broadway.
The church was there. So the first hardball baseball league for primarily Puerto Ricans was in Southie. Everybody will talk to you about El Monte de los Chivos, right? And I asked somebody from Southie later on, I says, oye, we used to call it El Monte de los Chivos. He says, yeah, Goats Hill. And that's the first Puerto Rican baseball league or Latino baseball league was in Southie. So there was a community in Southie. It was just like there was a community in Eastie the same way. It was at Maverick, and it was also at Orient Heights.
That's where my parents lived in the 70s. Yeah.
Right? So I remember reading in the Real Paper, right? Because that was a newspaper that they distributed in colleges at the time, of a Latino kid being murdered and hung by a basketball court, by the basketball rim in East Boston. Or you talk to a dear friend, I mean, Robert Lewis Jr., who many of you know. Jr. and his family were moved over to Maverick Square, and the issues that they lived just by trying to do housing integration, right? During this time period. So there was, the Latino community was bombed out of Southie just before the order started to be implemented. And they ended up in Watertown, or they ended up in Cardinal Cushing Center to be picked up and then relocated with the shirts on their back. I mean, there's a little history about that no one writes.
Yeah, that was that time I have
Some people write.
3 children.
Right? Go ahead.
Yeah, at that time I had 3 children, and we got moved 2 times from the Watertown. Oh, Waltham. I keep on saying Watertown, sorry.
Casi lo mismo.
And we would move to Harrison. How do you call it with that train? With that Huntington Avenue. There was another
Like Mission Hill. Hill?
like Mission Hill, yes. That's where they moved us from
further.
there
Okay.
afterwards. So we were out of our houses like maybe 2 months or close to 3 months.
Okay.
Yeah.
David, can you talk a little bit about how you got involved in and like the formation of El Comité, just a little bit for folks who are less familiar with El Comité's important history?
Yeah, so El Comité de Padres Pro Defensa de Educación Bilingüe is the official title of El Comité. El Comité was organized by, as I said, Nati y Daisy Díaz, Rodolfo Rodríguez, y Betty Rivera. When the busing started, right, the first orders were purely to commit to what the state law said, that you needed racial balance plans. A woman, Cape Verdean woman by the name of Patricia Quintana, married to a Puerto Rican man who lived in Villa Victoria, twin sons, one más oscurito que el otro, ¿verdad? Más blanquito que el otro, was sent, the dark one was sent when they needed a black racial balance plan to fulfill the racial balance plan, and the lighter skin was where white, they needed a more lighter skin to justify the racial balance plan. At the same time, the bilingual education had just been passed. I mean, you had leaders in the state level in the late 60s and 70s that pushed for the creation of first in the nation, Transitional Bilingual Education Act, Chapter 71A. And what that was a recognition is that as more and more academics started to write about how our generation, when they said to me, go to the school for the retarded because you didn't know English, a recognition that language rights was also a way of making sure that we kind of acculturated to the system without sacrificing our educational being, right? So it's how is it that we were learning English while at the same time keeping up with knowing math or whatever. But I mean, why is it that you had to stop your educational formation until you learn English, right? So here in the state, you had really, really great thinkers in the 60s, Latinos and Asians and Cape Verdeans who were thinking about these issues. When the first racial balance plans were issued from the Garrity Court, we were, yes, a footnote and an afterthought. And in the racial balance plans, we were nowhere near there. And that's why Pat Quintana came to IBA, when Lucy Cuadrado was the head of IBA, and complained about it. And Nati, Daisy, Rodolfo, and Betty. Betty was a community organizer at Villa Victoria at the time, said, look, we got to do something about this here. When the busing order came, So Hispanic Office of Planning and Evaluation, HOPE, had submitted an amicus brief saying that we were also being affected.
We being the Latino community, yeah.
The Latino communities were also being affected. And at the time when Pat Quintana talked about this racial balance plan, how it affected her twin sons, we then said, wait a second, we have to speak on behalf of families. We have to speak on behalf of the parents. We knew that the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund in New York was doing a lot of great work together with the NAACP, as much as in New York, but also in Philly and in Chicago, making impacts for our communities. Someone decided to contact them, and together with, at that time, it was with the NAACP lawyer, Larry Johnson, we made an argument that we should represent parents. So by that time, El Comité had organized. We had said to the court, parents should speak on behalf of parents. Hispanic Office of Planning and Evaluation, more academics, more college educators were saying we should speak. And with Larry Johnson and intervention in the court and a lot of organizing, we were able to get some really great thinkers to be expert witnesses for us to talk about the issue of language within a desegregation setting. And the important part of that was that Maria Brisk, Dr. Maria Brisk, from I think it was at BU at the time, was, diga? BC. All right, I apologize. Apologize to the alums.
Like BC Eagles, we got you.
And Dr. Maria Brisk, she came with her language rights issues and was a plaintiff intervener expert witness to talk about the issue. Why? When one of the, and John Mudd just gave me this here, one of the things that El Comité de Padres spoke about was that because we as a movement had had the law passed, Chapter 71A, we were saying that racial balance plans could not offset our language rights issues. We were saying, look, Carmen Pola, and I wish she would have been here, was she spoke about how, and just as Ms. Gonzalez said the same thing, we were being treated differently in schools. Carmen spoke about this all the time, everywhere we went, that we were side by side, we were being treated differently. Same concerns that we had in jobs with the Third World Jobs Clearinghouse, with the daycare movement, with the housing issue. Same thing we had with the educational issues. We were in schools just like the Black community because of racial segregation patterns here in Boston, where we had the same unequal education. But at the same time, and Comité was arguing is that we also had language rights issues. That was a hard concept, a lot for the NAACP to swallow. And it wasn't easy, right? So, but we made sure that we were building coalitions. There was a Say Brother did a TV program where we had...
That's publicly available if you want to see. That'd be very young on it.
I had hair.
You had a lot of hair.
What we did was that we opposed the 1975 racial balance plan, and we forced the school system essentially to abandon it at the last minute. Say Brother did an article, and Susan, representing the Asian community. I forget the gentleman's name, representing the Cape Verdean community, and myself. What we spoke about was that we were building coalitions with the Black community to say, don't fear us. In 75, when Kevin White tried to, because of Proposition 78, right, when they tried to cluster more kids in school, in classrooms, take it from 30 kids per teacher to 40 kids per teacher, the bilingual education law stipulated 20 to 1 if you had a paraprofessional, and 15 to 1 if you had a teacher, so that we could have better education. And when we raised that, we were raising it because also we didn't believe that 40 to 1 were our kids not in the bilingual education, that was fair, or that was fair to the teachers, or it was fair to the kids to be able to learn. So little by little, we made the issue of language rights and racial segregation into one. Not that everybody agreed with it in the Black community, but that was okay, because what we did was that organized linguistic minorities in the city. So it wasn't, meeting at the convent on Magazine Street was not just Latinos coming together. It was Latinos, Italians, Asian, Cape Verdeans. Some Haitians were starting to become more and more. And it was coalition building at the time. To organize Latinos, right? It was, like I said, we didn't have Univision, so we had to figure out how to get people into church basements and community centers so that we could have a conversation about our rights, right? We done social media, so getting the folks, it was door knocking, it was going to the primary areas. On Dudley Street, just around Columbia Road, it was Via Victoria, it was Mission Hill, and those are the primary areas where we were doing all the organizing. And it was just get people out there talking to Doña Juana, figure out, oh, Doña Juana, what's going on? Margarita Berrios, her kids in education, Eulalia Calderon, Rosa Sayas, huge the Sayas family on Dudley. I mean, so you had families, right? I mean, your father, when it was with the churches and organizing, we organized through as much the Catholic Church, and also the Protestant Church through St. Stephen's, but also the Protestant churches on Dudley. I mean, it was a community-wide effort to say to everybody, if you don't get out of your house and get involved, they're going to take it away from you. And the last point is that, so that we had, because I need to mention, because we need to repeat names, ¿verdad? De gente que hicieron impacto, because that's the important thing. Once the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund got involved, right after, or when El Comité de Padres was designated by the court as plaintiff intervener. So no, we were no longer just outsiders sending in briefs. We were insiders saying, you better take care of our issues. So we're not a footnote, we're a plaintiff intervener. As a plaintiff intervener, like I said, it was a Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, hired Carolyn Plater, a phenomenal attorney, Doyle Plater, Novick and Birkin, all right, on Talbot Avenue in Dorchester, who didn't know Spanish at the time, but little by little learned Spanish. Larry Johnson, as I mentioned, from the NAACP, who got involved. And it wasn't just a legal strategy, it was an organizing at the same time. So how did I get involved? I was the only one who spoke Spanish. I mean, the only one who spoke English among El Comité de Padres. And at that time, right, I mean, it happens to all our kids all the time. So I was 6 years old when we moved from Manatí to New York City. By the time I came to college, I had lost a lot of my Spanish. I could understand everything was in casa. My parents only spoke in Spanish, but little by little you learned English. And if it wasn't that I met up with Betty, who was more Spanish dominant, and I couldn't ask her out on a date if I didn't know Spanish. I learned Spanish así para rápido, right? And that's what it was. And so I was able to become a spokesperson. Then what do? I mean, it's in-your-face organizing, use the media to your maximum advantage, make sure that you have a lot of pancartas, ¿cómo se llaman?
Poster boards, yeah.
Poster boards. Yeah. So that the media could take a good picture of it, and therefore you could do it. That's why this photograph should be like this is history. All right, this is history. And you could see it all over town. I mean, when we got kicked out of Judge Garrity's court, I don't know how many times. Why? Because if we didn't speak Spanish, I had to do the translation. And he warned me a bunch of times not to translate. But if you're going to be there, if you're talking about us, how are we not going to pay attention? So I was a translator. I got kicked out enough there. And all the parents walked out. So what we decided to do, both at the 26 Court Street as well as the federal court on Post Office Square, is be loud and in your face and make sure that if the windows were open, they heard us. We learned, we had gas Stetner machines, and I know that's history. Look it up, Google it, and figure that out. We had gas Stetner machines that people donated to so we could put out leaflets. We had megaphones, ¿verdad? If you had one of those, you were like... So we always lent it to each other to make sure that we were loud and in your face. So what we didn't do was keep it as a legal strategy. We kept the organizing. South Boston Information Center was ready to beat us up on Columbia Road in Dudley when we were having a big demonstration just before school started in '76, because we said this is not going anywhere. So look, we get comfortable with the legal strategy and we forget about the community organizing. The beauty of El Comité de Padres, it did not forget about the community organizing. Y no, mi papá siempre me decía, ¿verdad? De que barriga llena, corazón contento, ¿verdad? Que that's what we say in Puerto Rico all the time. Full stomach, happy heart. Just because we were winning victories for getting classroom sizes smaller, getting racial balance plans that took into consideration Latino kids, making sure that we protected bilingual education, make sure that we had racial balance plans for administrators and teachers that also had not only others, but also had Hispanics and then others. And that we had kindergartens and extended kindergartens for bilingual kids. Getting the Rafael Hernandez School on Columbia Road as a victory. We were not content with those victories.
The symbolic ones.
The symbolic ones in court, we kept on organizing. At a point in time, that we didn't organize any longer. It's the same way. We became, right, that line in a movie, Shawshank Redemption, we became institutionalized. We learned how to become part of the system, and we worked within the system. We built coalitions differently, but we forgot about organizing. But those were different eras.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question, then we're going to transition and take a 2-second break to transition. For the rest of you, I want you to jump in too. So I'll ask a question, you can answer whatever you want. You can answer something else. The question is, for all of you, El Comité won a lot of things, right? There was a huge success in terms of fighting for bilingual education, creating separate racial categories for Latinos. So previously there was like a black or white category, and then there was Hispanic, black, Hispanic, white. And then they fought for just a Hispanic category because most people didn't feel comfortable with either category. But lots of wins, right? Expanding to include more Latino teachers, to include, to protect the clusters of bilingual ed. How do you think you did? Like, how do you think the movement did? So if you think about the 1970s and the 1980s, whether you were a student or parents, right? What was the impact of desegregation and all this organizing? Did you feel a change? Did you see a change in Boston Public Schools throughout the 70s and 80s? And you can also answer a different part.
I wanted to say, because it's just interesting here. We're sitting on the couch and the familiarity and the... So, you know how they say, if you see it, you can be it? And I would be remiss if I did not say this before we left this place here. So I told you I went to school. My issue with writing, and ended up going to college. After college, my heroes were Thurgood Marshall and other. I wanted to go to law school. I wanted to be a lawyer, right? But I only had certain models. And of course, I had other models nationally. They were Latino. And I wanted to say this in front of everybody because he doesn't know. So I was a student. I applied for an internship for the Boston Fair Housing Commission. Because I saw a man who was doing this type of work, civil rights work, which I was interested. And this man is David Cortiella. He hired me as an intern. So I'll tell you about names, and I'll tell you what comes out of these good things, to answer your question, is that it has impact as a young kid who granted, had some privilege with parents that were all educators, but I wanted to go to law school. And all the teachers didn't say that, but if it was not for someone like David Cortiella in his position, and me seeing that it can be done, I don't think I would have gone to law school. So I did go to law school, graduated, entered politics and government, and the rest is history from there. But David, thank you for being a model during those times for me.
Great. Thank you. I think one of the best parts of this is that just kind of the intergenerational piece that's very Latino based. We're going to get to Q&A in a minute. Sorry, thank you. I just wanted to see if you had thoughts about kind of the impact of the movement and desegregation in the 70s and 80s. I don't know if you want to, Mercedes, if you want to talk a little bit about if you thought anything changed. You started raising your own kids in the 70s and 80s. You had to send them to school. They went to Boston Public Schools. Did you feel the schools were better for Latino children? Did you feel they were more welcoming, that they cared more, that the parents were more involved?
Yes. By the time my kids went to school, I think the parents were more involved. And I think it got better, yes.
Yeah?
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
What about you, Debbie?
No.
No, I love it.
All right, so Betty became, so Betty was always an organizer, and Betty worked for the American Friends Service Committee, the bilingual unit there. Betty worked then for Citywide Parents Council. Betty then worked for the bilingual education department, and fought like crazy to get parent voices, organize voices of parents in a lot of different schools throughout the entire city, get them to speak up. But we were always on the outside looking in. All right, I mean, and I'll keep it clean, but in a city where we have such a large population, the quote constituents of the school department, and we don't have a Latino superintendent yet, or a deputy superintendent, a Latino. We're in the 21st century. So what impact have we made? We continue to be on the outside looking in. How could we allow the school department to do some of the things that it's currently doing, and we don't have voice to say, hey, stop it? God. So, and I was an insider too, but I worked for the Flynn administration from 85 to 94, and we tried to do stuff. But we're the outsiders always looking in. And if we don't, and I emphasize the importance of El Comité not only doing its legal struggles, but also coalition building and working closely with the Black community, that we still need an organizing strategy. And it was so important when Tomas and Lou said to me about organizing this and calling it disrupting the narrative, ¿verdad? It's a apropos title, because we gotta constantly continue to do the same thing. Disrupt the current narrative of who we are, what we represent, what we can or cannot achieve. Yeah, they don't send kids like me who didn't know Spanish to schools for the retarded. We're a little bit better than that. We send them to special ed, ¿verdad? Pero contra, we're still doing the same thing, slowing them down in their educational formation. We don't speak up enough, loudly enough. We have left it to the, quote, administrators, to the cocoroco, the educational system, to be the advocates and the voice, but they forget. Why? Because a lot of times there's no connection. We forced educators to think about us because we were organizing and we made an impact. And Where are we? I don't know.
Well, that's a perfect
leave it up to you.
transition. Perfect. We're going to thank everyone. So we're not done. So what we're going to do is take a 2-minute intermission. Feel free to use the restroom, get a drink, or we're going to transition to, we have 2 more panelists. And we're going to open it up to Q&A, so please don't forget your question. So 2-minute quick transition, and then we'll start back up again. Thank you.
So Dr. Rivera, a lot of panelists discussed the specific linguistics needs of Latino students who are migrants and English language learners. Can you talk a little about the discussion of language or bilingual education fit in today? Discuss the shift to sheltered English immersion programs and how effective that model has been.
Okay.
So it's not for here, so you're not going to sound louder. You need to do it though for our
I'll use my teacher voice. So want to first again just say how amazing the previous speakers were and what an honor it is to be here to be able to say just a few things. And I'm really speaking from my role both as a parent of a BPS student, a former parent council meeting, a former school committee member, but also from my work with the Gaston Institute for Latino Community Development and the long time work that we have been doing in monitoring the outcomes for English learners in our school district. And I also want to do a shout out to my mentor, Miren Uriarte, who's watching and already has texted. It's okay. And, really the work that, was being talked about here, it continues. And I have several of my former members of the English Learners Task Force, Suzanne Lee, my former co-chair, Mr. Mudd is here. Julia was on the committee back then. So there's a lot of folks that, have been really trying to, again, push the school district to really treat our English learners and give them the language access that they deserve. So language rights continues to be a significant issue since, we passed in 2002, the UNS initiative to really essentially outlaw bilingual education. And it was only in 2017 that we had the Look Act by the state legislature that tried to provide more alternatives to bilingual education. But that really, in BPS at least, has been very, frustratingly slow to roll out, particularly for the Spanish speakers, which are the majority, right? BPS is 43% Latinx kids. A third of our BPS students, a third of them are, English learners. And so there's been so much transition as well in that office that, we continue to really struggle with the sheltered English immersion, with not really providing enough dual language instruction. We just have the Margarita Muniz is the only high school, right, doing the dual language. And, we really are very slow to really continue to support the language rights. And this SEI model is this idea, and David, when David was talking about how he was, and other students were put, labeled as retarded or put in, special classes. This idea of mainstreaming is really the way, how they're doing inclusion in sheltered English immersion is also something that is very problematic. And we have to also really challenge, again, how it is that our Spanish speaking and our other English learners are continue to be put in these tracks. We also know another issue, right, that's going on is the continuing segregated schools. There was a big report that came out, that is looking at this. I have the report here that I can share with other folks later. But, you know, folks like Raul Fernandez worked on this, but this was a committee, right, a racial imbalance task force from the state, from DESE, that is showing, right, that our schools, some of them are more segregated today, right? And we're not just talking Boston, we're looking at Cambridge. You know, this is really a problem of, again, equity and access for our communities is continuing. Also, the Department of Justice still, right, has oversight over what is happening with our English learners. And we, you know, we still don't have much progress there. And I would love to hear, you know, again, from some of our current English, well, I know there were massive resignations recently from the English Learners Task Force. And I know some of those folks are here today to talk about why this mass resignation happened. And what I think is also very a big challenge for us is that some school districts, and not just Boston, are just outright refusing to even enroll our immigrant students. As you know, Lawyers for Civil Rights is really taking on a case in the Saugus, but we may, you know, this is scary because we may see this more school districts, right, asking for things like, you know, documentation and proof of citizenship in order to enroll. This is public education, and so by taking on one school district and then another, right, they're trying to set these precedents, right, for then the denial ultimately for linguistic rights. So this is something that we are also really trying to pay attention to at the Gaston Institute. But there's so many other issues, right? The Garrity Order also talked about teacher diversity, right? We're not there, right, on that, particularly, and not just for Latinx teachers, right, for Black teachers as well, right? Like there's still the real inequities in representation. We're seeing as well that there are, again, this push against ethnic studies, right? That's erasing. If we don't have the voices, we haven't had the voices, even less, right? If we're not allowing the instruction of ethnic studies, that's going to be, which is what we do, right? And so it's not just attacks, right, at the universities, as the universities are the enemy now, right? But this is really going to, again, have these multiplying effects in terms of bilingual education as well. And I would just add that, you know, these challenges as well today continue with schools like the Dever Elementary School being closed or being recommended to be closed. These are schools where it's mostly English learners. And the communication and the engagement, right, with our families is really lacking, right? And so I think that the kind of I don't know, sometimes I feel like we've gone back in time. Like it's almost, it's not worse, but it's bad. It's just as bad. It feels that way sometimes. And I think that's something that given what, you know, is happening in our country right now, particularly for immigrant students, it is very scary. And I know my students at UMass Boston who are immigrants are very scared, particularly our DACA students. And I can't imagine, right, like what will happen, right, when, you know, ICE shows up, right, at our schools, as like happened in Chicago, and maybe happening other places. So I do think that, you know, history, like, we learn from the history, but, you know, where do we go with this? Like, how do we really resist, right, the oppression and the continued, stigmatization of English learners, and this still persists today. So, sorry.
Okay, so Simel speaks Spanish, so she's gonna answer in Spanish, and then I'm going to translate. So, ¿qué recomendarías a otros padres que quieren ser más activas en las escuelas de Boston y asegurarse de sus hijos reciban una educación de calidad?
Buenas noches. Lo que les recomiendo a todos los padres, voy a poner mi ejemplo. Antes yo era una madre que tenía 2 trabajos, solo llevaba a mi hija a la escuela y participaba a veces en las reuniones escolares y muchas veces no tenía deseo porque o no me daban una interpretación de calidad o no había interpretación. Entonces, gracias a San Stevens, que conocí esa maravillosa organización, aprendí a conectar con las familias, a conectar con los padres, a organizarme. Entonces, ¿qué les recomiendo a los padres? Que aunque trabajen 2 trabajos, ¿para qué te esfuerzas tanto si no sacas tiempo para poner atención a la educación de tu hijo? ¿Para qué te esfuerzas tanto para trabajar y proveerle a tus hijos algo que tú puedes hacer participando en su educación? Involúcrense en las escuelas, en la educación de sus hijos. Pueden educarse, porque muchos padres creemos que hablarle a los hijos en nuestro idioma lo vamos a confundir. Y eso es una equivocación. Antes yo pensaba así, pero no es así. Ahora tenemos que enseñarle a nuestros hijos y sentirnos orgullosos del idioma que hablamos. Queremos que, uniendo nuestras voces, podemos exigir más escuelas bilingües, más programas bilingües, que los estudiantes aprendiendo en su idioma nativo, los nuevos estudiantes, los aprendices de idioma inglés, pueden hacer una transición más fácil. ¿Por qué quitarnos nuestro idioma? ¿Por qué mejor de quitarnos nuestro idioma no tratan de crear que tengamos 2 idiomas? Entonces, participar más en las escuelas, en la educación, unirse a organizaciones comunitarias, a comunicarse con los padres, con otros padres, para alzar la voz y poder participar en actividades, reconocer sus derechos. Creo que eso sería una buena opción para los padres, a pesar de que tengan más de un trabajo o más escuelas.
So she was saying, so she was saying that at first she had her kids in BPS and she worked 2 jobs and she wasn't as active in the kids' education as she was now. But St. Stephen's, the organization, allow her to become more active in their schooling. And she believes that it's really important for organizations like this, not only to recognize that these kids, when they come, they need to learn English, but that it's important to still emphasize that Spanish and learning of Spanish as they grow older. Even if you work a lot, even if it's hard for you to be maybe every day in the kids' everyday learning, it's important to learn about the school they're in and talk to other parents, and really emphasize that coming together as a community makes it better for the students. So if you have the ability to talk to other parents, to maybe talk a little bit more with the teacher, or find a ways for someone to interpret for you or do these things, you can give your child a better education in that same way, even if you didn't have it yourself. And the more, like she was saying, we are as a community, the better. The same things that the people from before were saying and the same people now. We are stronger as one than we are divided. And I think that that's probably the best recommendation from since the 1960s until 2025. So. She has one more thing to say.
Okay. En San Stevens tenemos una campaña a favor de los English Learning y hemos creado un Action Network donde hemos colectado más de 300 firmas de familias apoyando esta acción. Entonces debemos de luchar juntos como familia, como padres, para alzar nuestra voz.
So there's an action plan that they have that over 300 people have signed to actually help build this unity that they have. At St. Stephen's. On papel or algo so people know about it.
Oh, yeah.
And there's some resources there for you guys to have about it too, but it's really important, and it helps like parents like her and parents all over the city with it. So, yeah, thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
So we're opening the panel to questions, but you can feel free to ask the first half panelists and the second half.
Yeah.
We're all still here.
And share your experiences.
Yes.
Hey everyone, thank you for presenting tonight. So 2 things. I am one of those people that has zero patience for people who don't know like history. I'm always like, Google it. And I'm 51 and it's 2025 and I never thought about the voices that were absent, omitted, deleted from the busing. I'm sitting here today going, oh yeah, there were Spanish-speaking people in Boston, right? So that's why like sort of having forums like this are so important. So thank you, Tag, for doing that. Appreciate love y'all.
Shout out Tag.
And then second, what really struck me tonight, beyond sort of just like and mind you, I'm a historian, right? Okay, so what struck me was one of the presenters just nonchalantly saying that her house was bombed. And we were both sitting here like, wait, did she say house was bombed? And so when I think about that, right, and she's a mother, grandmother, so she has overcome all that, is to think about the terror that our Spanish-speaking children are feeling now, particularly immigrants and non-immigrants, because they're picking up everybody. Because as a Haitian, I'm not omitting the terror and the hatred and the vitriol of my population, but what we're seeing in the media, and media really is the message, right? Is this is an attack on Spanish-speaking folks. And so I don't know whom the folks are that mobilize, but how do we ensure that whatever terror these children and their families are feeling, we can somehow mitigate it. So that's something that just sort of struck me, like, oh, the house was bombed. Oh, and we talk about this stuff so nonchalant, but this is terrorism. So what is happening now to our children? Here, sort of, again, St. Stephen's, the group at St. Stephen's, also there's another CPAC and other groups, for sure, there's people doing things, but just ensuring that the system ain't gonna protect us. So leaving it to BPS is not gonna happen. So what are we doing as a community? So thank you.
In the back.
Oh, okay. Hello everyone, my name is Tracy Lifka. I work for the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. David, it's so good to see you. I remember starting my career working with David. He's a big time. He was a big timer back then. I was a product of desegregation of schools from 76 to 80. I lived in the South End. Everyone knows about the South End. On the Columbus Ave side, that was basically the black population. I'm speaking from the black perspective now. On the Columbus Ave, years ago, the Latino community for us was pretty much just Puerto Rican. And on the Columbus Ave side, on the Tremont side, was pretty much the Puerto Rican community. The blacks and the Puerto Ricans were like this. We were close. We did everything.
That's what Mel King would have said.
So the Mel King is true. They held court down at Carter's Field. I don't know if people remember that. Carter's Field on the tennis courts every Saturday. I can remember Saturday afternoons and evenings, the Puerto Rican softball teams that would play. I mean, really good game. And we'd all be there. It was a community show. We also had black mothers that did not play when it came to their children's education and other children in the community. They organized, there would be 15 to 20 of them, my mother included. When they came up to a school, you knew they were coming. And not only did they speak for their own children, but they spoke for my boy Perfecto Ayala, for Lewis and all the other Latinos that were in the community. So I just want to be clear, in that time, it was a tough time. There were no guns and all of that back in the day. There was a lot of stabbings. Going to school was a difficult situation. I had friends that didn't graduate because they couldn't go. A lot of different things happened at that time, but our communities were immersed together. We did everything together. One last thing I wanted to say about working together, but I can't remember. But I think what's key too is you have the Mel Kings, the Chuck Turners, and those folks in the world. But the community, inside that community, the parents, they have to organize as well to support what they're doing, as well as to support the general community. But years ago, we were all together. It was one big team. We ate together, laughed together, cried together. and everything was sports. And someone mentioned all the teams. I can remember we played hockey back in the day, you know. So the kids from South convinced us to play ice hockey, and that was the whole. We had to stay back with tennis ball. But yeah, we were all very close, and it was very conducive. It was a lot of fun. Even though there were some difficult things going on around education, and a lot of that was done by the black women in our community, which are the foundation of the black community.
Thank you. I just want to say something quickly. I want to speak on behalf of my sister, Solina. She's a little nervous to talk. But she currently goes to school in Newton Public Schools, and she's saying that, especially with the current situation of what's going on, that there are students in her school who are undocumented. She does understand the fear, even at 14, about her friends and other people in her community who she knows, not just in Boston Public Schools, but as a MECO student. And that it's something that really is happening now, as Dr. Rivera was saying. And how it's important that she even has, support from us to recognize that she has her own fears of like what could happen to people that she knows. So I just want to speak on her behalf for that.
We also, I have some of my students printed out the Know Your Rights. They're very small, but in English and Spanish. So they're over there by the bar. By the bar, if you want one. Yes, please do share the.
Yes, right here.
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. Lots of comments. I'm Suzanne Lee. Some of you know me. I was the co-chair of the task force with Lorna and Berlin for a long, long time. After 35 years of being a teacher and principal in the Boston Public Schools. I was a teacher first year of busing. So all this, and I'm so glad to hear from David. Bring me back to those old days, and I'm so glad that he brought up that there's nothing replaces the power of organizing.
That's right.
And this is what we need now.
Yep.
That it doesn't matter if we have people from our community elected, like Julia.
I'm an organizer, just so you know.
We have Rafaela on the school committee. So without the community being organized, their voices on those bodies does not go that far. So our community has to be organized, particularly now that everybody's talking about how we're in a bad time. So this discussion and this history is really, really, really important because we've been in bad time before. How do we survive that? How do we resist that? It comes down to organizing. So that is the lesson that we need to carry with us and continue to do that because together we are the power. But right now, if we're not organized, we have already given up. We'll be lost if we're not organized. So my comment is get organized.
That's right.
I'm going to take one more. You'd like to speak?
Okay. Okay. My name's John Mudd. Too long an education advocate in Boston and was a member of the Yellow Task Force. I think when I look at the history, the tension that David and others talked about between language rights and desegregation is still alive and well in Boston. And unfortunately, language rights are being lost. And they may not be sending so many English learners into SPED, they are, but they're sending them into English immersion classes, into general education with just the SL support, and they're transferring them away from programs that offer instruction in native language. And that was one of the key issues of the task force and why many of us resigned. And so the question is, we have people here from different perspectives. Could you, David, could you, Lorna, could you, from Simel, from Rodriguez, from St. Stephen's, talk about the importance of using home language in instruction, using home language at home, as the foundation for success for these children. And what the El Padres started in 74 and 75.
Can I make an announcement?
Do you want to get started while she's translating, and then we'll move back? Maybe you can,
Yeah. So John is at. Oh, sorry. John's absolutely right. Look, we have a different culture. We have a different language. I know second, third generation, we start to lose some of that, but we still have a cultural identity. We're different. And everybody reminds us that we're different. I could look blanquito, but the minute I open my mouth and I'm supporting my community, olvídate, I'm not blanquito no more. It doesn't make a difference, right? So we all still have an opportunity to continue to learn our language. All right, both my kids are fully bilingual, but that takes a conscious effort to be able to do that. So we have to talk to ourselves also and say to our own folks, hey, come on, we have a cultural identity that we also have to respect. Second, look, so before you asked, where are we? What's the state of affairs? We lost bilingual education, ¿verdad? And we lost because nobody coalesced around us. They didn't care about whether we had bilingual education as a transition to something else. They believed the nonsense that was being spewed at that time, racist as it was then, it's still now, of that why cluster our kids. We're segregating our kids so they could learn our language and then transition to English. So they equated clustering with segregation, and that became the death knell. Y si no se lo están dando a todo el mundo, why are you giving it to those people? It was the reason how they got rid of Chapter 71A here. Because the Voice USA, whatever they were called at that time, kept on talking about is that we were getting something different. Contra. We were. And that was the only way to be able for us to transition. And why is it now that we, I don't want to be critical of folks, but why is it that now we're allowing them to do the same exact thing as John said? I mean, we're letting them with a, quote, little bit of support. This was 1961 when I came to New York City. It was the same exact thing. I was separated from my classmates in the second grade with, I think it was called SRL, and it was you learn by colors and by stars. And if you increase your proficiency, you got different stars. And you move through, something, I mean, growing up bilingual, you don't never learn either language correctly. And you never learn it proficiently, ¿verdad? We lose our language. We never learn English enough to compete the way it is. Pero contra, the minute we start to learn it, then they treat us differently, ¿verdad? It was what Eldin was saying. So the thing that we got to be thinking about, and I'm sorry, taking up time, pero it's that we're living in a situation that if you're a white male, you're not any longer valid. So you got someone, number 47, who said because of the crash, and I was there last night when there was the crash at DC airport, his first thing out of his mouth was that it had to be DEI, they had to be less than, because if it wasn't, for him, if it wasn't a white male that wasn't driving it, then it was us, then olvídate. So I got off the plane and it was an Asian pilot, and I said, thank you. Thank you. Because we're living in an environment that it's even before 1961 when I got to New York City. And it's this experience that Senora Gonzalez spoke about of being firebombed out of Southie in 1973. Or Junior Lewis being thrown out of Maverick, and families being burnt out of Orient Heights. You olvídate, we never were in Charlestown. So there's ways for us to be able to really recapture this. One is orgullo propio. We got to make sure that we take care of our own. Apoyamos lo nuestro y eso que nos apoyan, ¿verdad? Is the theme that we should constantly repeat. And the second part of it is Susan is one of the best. Organize. Organize, organize, and organize. And don't forget.
Amen.